The distress signal was not a distress signal. That was the first problem. That was the problem that Commander Voth Thessaly was sitting with when her navigation officer brought the contact data to her station on the Valith Sovereignty's survey vessel IVS Relentless Current, sitting with it the way you sat with a problem that did not fit any category in your experience, and that required you to either find the category or accept that the category did not exist. The signal had the correct frequency. It had the correct mathematical structure. It had the correct pulse interval and the correct power signature and every technical characteristic that the Conclave Standard Emergency Beacon was supposed to have. The Conclave Standard Emergency Beacon was broadcast by vessels in distress to indicate that the vessel required assistance, that beings were aboard who needed rescue, that the situation was urgent and the location was here. The signal said all of that. What it did not say, because signals could not say things in the qualitative sense that the problem required, was what Thessaly's sensor officer had reported when she ran the full scan on the signal's origin point. The sensor officer had said, "Commander, the signal is coming from inside the Veth corridor." Thessaly had said, "Repeat that." The sensor officer had said it again. Thessaly had looked at the navigation display showing the Veth corridor, which was the name that the Valith Sovereignty's cartographic division had given to the region of space that the region occupied, and which was a name that communicated nothing about what the region actually was, which was one of the most comprehensively avoided stretches of space in this sector of the galaxy. Not because it was dangerous in any specific and measurable sense. That was the thing about the Veth corridor that made it difficult to explain to beings who had not been near it. It was not a radiation hazard. It was not a navigational obstacle. It did not contain anomalies that threatened vessel systems. It was, by every instrument that had ever been pointed at it from a safe distance, empty in the way that deep space was empty, which was to say as empty as any comparable volume of space. And yet, every spacefaring species that had mapped this region had mapped the Veth corridor and had then, without exception, drawn a line around it and written some version of the same notation. The Velthun notation said, "Approach not recommended." The Drakvari notation said, "Void space, avoid." The Theresi notation, which was the most extensive because the Theresi had sent 3 survey missions to the corridor's edge, before the 3rd survey team had filed a report that the Theresi Cartographic Authority had classified and never fully released, said, "Navigation advisory, extended presence in proximity to this region, produces psychological effects not consistent with normal deep space operations." Psychological effects. The Valith Sovereignty's notation simply said, "The corridor." Like it was the only one. Every crew that had passed near it described the same thing, not the same hallucination or the same specific experience, the same quality of experience, a weight, a presence that was not a presence, the specific sensation of being observed by something that was not there, from a direction that the instrument said was empty and that every instinct said was not. Thessaly had been near the corridor once before, 8 years ago, on a survey mission that had been routed through the adjacent region and had passed within 6 light hours of the corridor's edge. She had not told anyone about what she had experienced during those 6 hours, not because the experience was dramatic, because it was not dramatic, and the not dramatic was harder to describe than the dramatic. It had felt like something was waiting. Not threateningly, not aggressively, something patient and old and not particularly interested in her specifically, but aware of her in the way that something very large was aware of very small things that passed near it. She had said nothing about it. She had noted in her personal log that she found the region psychologically taxing and had rated the notation adequate. And now a distress signal was coming from inside it. She said, "Full sensor sweep of the signal origin. I want everything." The sensor officer ran the sweep. The sweep came back. The sensor officer read the results. She said, "Commander, There are structures at the signal origin. Thessaly said, "What kind of structures?" The sensor officer said, "The resolution at this distance is not sufficient for detailed classification. The structures are artificial, multiple units, heat signatures consistent with inhabited structures, power generation signatures, atmosphere containment signatures." She said, "Life signs." The sensor officer said, "Yes, 47 life signs, human biology." Thessaly looked at the navigation display. She looked at the Veth corridor. She looked at the position of the signal origin, which was not at the edge of the corridor, not near the border where the cartographic advisories began, but deep inside it, in the region that the Therese's classified Third Survey report apparently described in terms that the Therese Cartographic Authority had decided not to release publicly. She said, "The signal, the distress signal." Her communications officer said, "Yes, Commander." She said, "Run the diagnostic again. Confirm it is a standard conclave emergency beacon." He ran it. He said, "Confirmed, standard beacon, all parameters nominal." She said, "Is there any other transmission from the origin point?" He said, "Running scan." He ran it. He said, "Yes, Commander, there is a second transmission, non-emergency frequency, standard communication band, encrypted, but the encryption is Earth standard commercial grade." She said, "Decrypted." He said, "Yes, Commander." The decryption took 4 minutes. He said, "Commander, the second transmission is a booking confirmation." She said, "A what?" He said, "A booking confirmation. Standard commercial format. It is confirming an accommodation reservation for a party of 4 at a facility designated Void's Edge Resort, Units 7 through 9, for a period of 14 days. The bridge of the relentless current was very quiet. Thessaly said, "Say that again." He said it again. She looked at the navigation display. She looked at the Veth corridor. She looked at the position marked by the signal and the structures, and the 47 life signs, and the booking confirmation for 14 days at something called Void's Edge Resort. She said to no one in particular, "They built a resort." Nobody said anything. She said, "In the Veth corridor." Nobody said anything. She said, "Humans built a resort inside the Veth corridor, and 47 of them are currently staying in it." Her first officer, a careful veteran named Dreven who had been in the survey division for 16 years, and who had developed across 16 years the capacity to process unusual information without visible reaction, said, "The distress signal." Thessaly said, "Yes. What is a distress signal doing transmitting from a functioning resort in the Veth corridor?" Dreven said, "Possible malfunction." Thessaly said, "Possible or?" Dreven said, "Or what?" Thessaly said, "Or it is not a distress signal." He said, "It is technically a distress signal, all parameters confirmed." She said, "What if they use it as something else?" He said, "Beacons are not typically repurposed as." She said, "As what?" He said, "I was going to say location markers, but that is a stretch." She said, "Plot a course to the signal origin." He said, "Commander, the corridor." She said, "I know." He said, "The survey division guidelines recommend against extended operations within." She said, "I know, plot the course." He plotted it. She looked at the course. She said, "Crew advisory. We are approaching and entering the Veth corridor to investigate a signal of unknown nature at an apparent human habitation. All personnel should be aware that operations in this region have historically produced psychological effects that are not fully characterized. If any crew member experiences significant distress, they should report to the medical officer immediately. Any request to discontinue approach will be evaluated on individual basis. We go slow and we go careful." She said, "Execute." The relentless current moved toward the Veth corridor. The effect began at approximately the same distance Thessaly remembered from 8 years ago. Not dramatic, the weight, the patience, the sense of something that had been here longer than they had, and that was not hostile and was not welcoming and simply was in the way that very old things were. She watched her crew. She watched them feel it. She watched the sensor officer's hand tighten slightly on her console. She watched the navigation officer's posture change in the small way that posture changed when a person was managing something internally. She watched Dreven, who was the most experienced person on the bridge, set his jaw in the specific way of someone who has decided they are going to do something and is implementing the decision regardless of what they feel. Nobody said anything. Nobody asked to stop. She noted this in her assessment and continued. The structures became visible on the high-resolution sensors when they were 4 light hours inside the corridor. Thessaly looked at the sensor data. She said on screen. The screen showed what the sensors had resolved. The structures were not what she had expected. She was not sure what she had expected. Something utilitarian, perhaps. The kind of prefabricated habitat modules that remote installations used. Something that communicated that the people inside understood they were in a place that required serious engineering solutions and had applied those solutions without aesthetics. The structures on the screen were not utilitarian. They were beautiful. Not ostentatiously beautiful. Not the kind of beautiful that required explanation or announcement. The kind of beautiful that came from someone making choices about form as well as function, from someone deciding that the place they were building mattered and that mattering was worth expressing in the design. The structures were arranged in a cluster. The main building was a central hub with a generous viewport profile, oriented to face the corridor's deepest interior. The surrounding units were smaller, connected to the hub by enclosed walkways, each one with its own viewport array. There were external platforms, exposed to space and to the corridor's particular quality of emptiness, accessed through pressure locks with furniture attached to them. Chairs. Actual chairs bolted to platforms in the void. Thessaly looked at the chairs. She said, "Sensor officer, the platforms, the external platforms with the furniture." The sensor officer said, "Yes, Commander." She said, "Are they pressurized?" The sensor officer said, "No, they are vacuum, standard vacuum-rated external structures." She said, "And the furniture?" The sensor officer said, "The furniture appears to be rated for vacuum use, constructed for external placement." She said, "They sit outside." The sensor officer said, "The heat signatures on 2 of the external platforms suggest current occupancy, Commander." Thessaly said, "They are sitting outside, right now, in the Veth corridor." The sensor officer said, "The signature count is consistent with 2 individuals in sealed suits on the external platforms." "Yes." Thessaly looked at the screen. At the structures that someone had built here, in the place that every species mapped and notated and avoided, with chairs on platforms facing the deepest part of the void and 2 humans currently sitting in them. She opened the communications channel. She said, "This is Commander Voth Thessaly of the Valith Sovereignty Survey Vessel IVS Relentless Current. We are responding to a distress signal at your location. Please confirm your status." The response came back in the time it took for the signal to cross the remaining distance and return. A woman's voice, relaxed in the specific way of someone who had been sitting in a chair looking at something for a while and was in no particular hurry about anything. She said, "Hi there, we are fine. Sorry about the beacon, it goes off automatically whenever a new vessel gets within range. We have been meaning to look at the settings. Is everyone on your ship okay?" Thessaly said, "We are." The beacon indicated distress. The voice said, "Yeah, it is a leftover from the construction phase when we needed survey vessels to be able to find us. We should have decommissioned it months ago. Again, sorry for the inconvenience." Thessaly said, Your facility. You are operating a hospitality facility at this location. The voice said, Void's Edge Resort. 14 units, full service, open year-round. Have you had a chance to see our brochure? We can send it over if you like. Thessaly said, I would appreciate the brochure. The brochure arrived. Thessaly read the brochure. The brochure was the most disorienting document she had read in 16 years of survey work. It described Void's Edge Resort as the galaxy's premier destination for deep void experience, offering unparalleled solitude, extraordinary darkness, and the unique psychological environment of extended proximity to authentic void space. It described the external viewing platforms as a signature feature, designed for optimal void immersion. It described a program called the Silence Sessions that it said were available twice daily and involved guided meditation on the exterior platforms. It described the cuisine as locally sourced where possible, and noted that the chef specialized in dishes that complemented the void aesthetic. It said the void aesthetic. It had a section called What Our Guests Say. Thessaly read the guest testimonials. One said, I have been to 12 spa destinations across conclave space. Nothing compares. The void is the real thing. 5 stars. One said, my husband and I come every year for our anniversary. The darkness here is unlike anything else. You feel it in your bones. We cannot recommend it highly enough. One said, I was skeptical. My therapist suggested it. Best decision I ever made. The void puts everything in perspective. One said, the external platforms are incredible. I sat out there for 4 hours. I could feel it watching me and I just sat with it. Life-changing. Thessaly stopped on the last one. She read it again. I could feel it watching me and I just sat with it. She looked up from the brochure. She looked at the navigation display. She thought about 8 years ago, and the 6 hours near the corridor's edge, and the wait and the patience, and the feeling of something old and not hostile, and not welcoming and simply there. She thought about what it had felt like. She thought about what the guest testimonial had called it. Life-changing. She thought about 2 humans currently sitting on external platforms in vacuum-rated chairs, looking at the void that had made the Therese's third survey team write a classified report about psychological effects. She opened the channel again. She said, we would like to approach your facility. We have some questions. The voice said, of course. Welcome to Void's Edge. Can I ask how many are in your crew? I want to make sure we have enough refreshments. Thessaly said, 17. The voice said, wonderful. We will have something ready. Come around to the docking bay on the east side. It is the one with the green light. Thessaly found the green light. She docked. The woman who met them in the docking bay was approximately 50 years old and had the quality of someone who had spent a great deal of time outdoors, or in whatever the space-based equivalent of outdoors was, which was apparently the exterior platforms of a void resort. She was comfortable in the way of people who were comfortable in their specific place, and who knew it and had made peace with the knowing. Her name was Sira Adami. She was the resort's founder and managing director, and Thessaly would learn, the person who had decided that the Veth corridor specifically was the right location, and who had spent 4 years convincing financial partners, construction crews, and the Conclave's licensing division that this was a viable and legal enterprise. She said, Commander Thessaly, welcome. I apologize again about the beacon. Thessaly said, it was not inconvenient. We were in the area. She said, not many vessels come through this area. Thessaly said, no, the corridor has a reputation. Sira Adami smiled. It was the smile of someone who had heard the word reputation used in relation to something they understood very well, and from a perspective entirely different from the speaker's. She said, yes, it does. She said, can I show you the facility while we talk? I find the space easier to explain in context. Thessaly said, please. The tour of Void's Edge Resort took 40 minutes. Thessaly spent most of those 40 minutes in the specific cognitive state of someone whose existing framework is being repeatedly tested and who has decided to observe before concluding. The central hub was comfortable in a way that was carefully considered rather than accidentally achieved. The furniture was oriented toward the viewports. The viewports were large and clean, and framed the corridor's void in the way that art was framed, deliberately, with attention to what the framing communicated about the thing inside it. There were guests in the hub, 7 of them at various tables and chairs doing various things, reading, drinking something hot. One was simply sitting and looking at the viewport with the expression of someone engaged in an activity that did not require movement. They looked up when Thessaly and her crew came through. None of them looked alarmed. None of them looked like people who were in distress. They looked like people on vacation. Sierra led them to the viewing corridor, which connected the hub to the external platforms through a series of pressure locks, and which was lined with viewports that faced the void in different directions. She said, "The corridor has a particular quality. You have felt it." Thessaly said, "Yes." She said, "What did it feel like?" Thessaly said, "Like something very large and very old that was aware of my presence." Sierra Adami nodded with the nod of someone receiving accurate information. She said, "Yes, that is close. We describe it to guests as presence. The presence is the product." Thessaly said, "The product." She said, "What guests come here for?" "The presence." Thessaly said, "They come here to feel that." She said, "They come here to sit with it." Thessaly looked through the viewport. At the void. At the deep unlit nothing of the corridor that had made every species that approached it turn around and add a notation to their charts. She said, "Why?" Sierra Adami said, "That is the question everyone asks." She said, "And the answer is different for each guest. For some it is the perspective. For some it is the quiet. For some it is the specific experience of feeling small in a way that is clarifying rather than frightening." She said, "Humans have a complicated relationship with feeling small." Thessaly said, "In what sense?" She said, "In most of our lives, feeling small is something we try to avoid. We fill our time and our spaces and our attention to avoid the feeling. And then we come here and we feel small, and we discover that we have been working very hard to avoid something that is actually useful." She said, "The void makes you honest. It is very difficult to lie to yourself about what matters when you are sitting on a platform looking at something that has existed for longer than your species, and that will continue to exist long after. The things you have been lying to yourself about become visible." She said, "That is useful." Thessaly looked at the viewport. She said, "The Theresi conducted 3 survey missions to the edge of this corridor. The 3rd mission produced a report that was classified." Sierra said, "Yes." Thessaly said, "What do you know about that report?" Sierra said, "I have read the parts of it that have been released. The parts that remain classified are not available to me, but the psychological effects section of the released portions is very consistent with what guests describe." Thessaly said, "And yet you built here." Sierra said, "Yes." Thessaly said, "Why?" Sierra Adami looked at the viewport. She said, "Because the Theresi survey team experienced what they experienced and they classified it as a hazard, a psychological effect to be avoided, something that happened to them that they did not want to happen and that they wanted to warn others away from." She said, "I read that report and I thought something different." Thessaly said, "What did you think?" Sierra said, "I thought that the experience they described was the experience of being genuinely present in a place that demanded presence. That the psychological effect was the effect of having all the ordinary distractions stripped away and being left with only the actual experience of existing in a very large universe." She said, I thought the Theresi classified it as a hazard because it was uncomfortable and unfamiliar, not because it was harmful. She said, and I thought that something that was uncomfortable and unfamiliar, and that stripped away ordinary distractions, and left you with the actual experience of existing was not a hazard. She said, it was the experience every person I had ever known who had done significant inner work described as what the work felt like. She said, the corridor is just the outside version of that work. Thessaly looked at the viewport. She thought about the wait. She thought about the patience. She thought about what it meant that humans had felt the same thing the Theresi survey team had felt, and had built chairs. She said the external platforms, the chairs bolted to the vacuum surfaces. Sierra said, yes. She said, you sit outside. Sierra said, the best experience is without the viewport glass between you and the void, with only your suit and the emptiness. It is more direct. She said, would you like to try it? Thessaly said, aye. She stopped. She looked at Sierra Adami. She looked at the viewport. She thought about 8 years ago, and the 6 hours and the wait and choosing to describe it as psychologically taxing, because she did not have better language. She said yes. The suit preparation took 20 minutes. The exterior pressure lock took 3 minutes to cycle. Thessaly stepped onto the platform. She sat in the chair. She looked at the void. The void looked back. Not with menace. The weight was there, the patience was there, the old enormous awareness of her small presence was there, all of it exactly as she remembered it and more immediate without the viewport glass. She sat with it. She sat with it the way she had not allowed herself to sit with it 8 years ago, because 8 years ago she had been the commanding officer of a survey vessel, and commanding officers of survey vessels did not sit with things. They categorized them and filed them and recommended avoidance. She sat with it now. She did not know how long she sat with it. When she became aware of time again, Sierra Adami was in the adjacent chair. Thessaly said through the suit communication system, how long? Sierra said, an hour and a half. Thessaly said, I lost track. Sierra said, yes, that is the other thing. Thessaly said, what? Sierra said, time does something different here. When you are genuinely present, it stops being the thing you are tracking. Thessaly looked at the void. She thought about the chair she was sitting in. She thought about the person who had decided to bolt chairs to platforms in the void, because the experience was better without the glass between you and the emptiness. She thought about the guest testimonial that said life-changing. She said, this is why humans are. She stopped. Sierra said, why humans are what? Thessaly said, I have been studying human civilization as part of my work. The output rate, the productivity, the rate at which humans produce things that other civilizations do not expect them to be able to produce yet. She said, the Conclave's research community has been trying to explain it for 42 years. She said, there is a researcher at the Valith Institute for Cognitive Sciences who has been studying human sleep. She identified a second cognitive system that processes problems during sleep. She published the preliminary findings, and the field has been recalibrating around them for 8 months. She said, and I am sitting in a chair in the void, and I am thinking about what this is. Sierra said, what is it? Thessaly said, this is the practice. She said, you come here. You sit in the discomfort. You sit with the thing that every instinct says you should avoid. You sit with the weight and the patience and the enormous oldness of the thing, and you do not run. You do not file a report recommending avoidance. You bolt chairs to a platform and you sit in them. She said, and something happens when you do that. Sierra said, what happens? Thessaly said, I do not know yet, but something happens. The guest who said the void puts things in perspective. The guest who said it was life-changing. the researcher who found the second cognitive system working on problems during sleep, the doctoral student who wrote a margin note on a 9,000-year-old paper at 200 in the morning. She said they all sat with something. She said all of them sat with the uncomfortable thing instead of avoiding it. She said, "Your species has built an entire resort in the place every other species avoids to facilitate sitting with the uncomfortable thing." Sierra was quiet for a moment. She said, "I would describe it differently." Thessaly said, "How would you describe it?" Sierra said, "I would say that we come here because we have discovered that the things we are most afraid of are the things that, when you actually sit with them, turn out to contain the things we most need." She said, "The void is just the most obvious version of that." She said the whole corridor, all the notations, all the advisories, all the classified reports, the thing every species mapped and marked and stayed away from. She said, the thing inside it that every species called a psychological hazard and filed under a void. She said is presence. She said, it is the experience of being genuinely present in a genuinely old and large universe. She said, and the things that happen to you when you are genuinely present in a genuinely old and large universe are not comfortable, but they are true. She said we like true. She said we built a resort to be near it. Thessaly sat with that. She sat with it in the chair on the platform in the void. She said the doctoral student. Sierra said, "I do not know about a doctoral student." Thessaly said, "There was a doctoral student who wrote a margin note that changed the understanding of physics. She wrote it at 200 in the morning. She had been reading a 9,000-year-old paper, and she had written what is this assuming that it has not declared as an assumption." She said she sat with the uncomfortable thing, the paper that everyone read and accepted, the assumption that nobody questioned because the framework was built on it. She said she sat with the discomfort of the thing being possibly wrong. Sierra said, and she was right. Thessaly said she was right. Sierra said yes. Thessaly said, and the Veth corridor. Sierra said every species read the cartographic record, the advisories, the classified reports, the psychological hazard notation. She said, and everyone avoided it. She said, except us. Thessaly said, you sat with the discomfort. Sierra said, we read the Theresi report, and we thought the psychological hazard was the description of what happened when you had all your distractions removed. She said, and we thought that sounded like something worth paying for. She said, so we built a resort. Thessaly looked at the void. She said, the chairs. Sierra said, yes. She said, you specifically designed chairs for external placement in vacuum so that guests could sit outside. Sierra said, the experience is better without the glass. She said, it is more direct. She said, you want the direct experience of the thing. Sierra said, yes. She said, the thing that every other species classifies as a hazard. Sierra said, we classify it as the product. She said, the presence is what guests are paying for. She said, we just made it accessible. Thessaly sat in the chair in the void for another 20 minutes before they cycled back through the pressure lock. Inside, in the warmth of the hub, with the viewport framing the corridor the way art was framed, she stood with Sierra Adami and looked at the current guests. The person who had been looking at the viewport when Thessaly arrived was still looking at the viewport. The 7 people at their tables and chairs had been joined by 2 more, fresh from the platforms, still in the specific quality of presence that the exterior produced and that Thessaly was beginning to recognize. She said, how did you know? Sierra said, know what? She said that it would work, that people would come here, that the thing in the corridor was the thing your species would call a product. Sierra said, I did not know. She said, I thought it might work. I had sat near the corridor once before I built this, on a transit that took me within 8 light hours of the edge. I felt the weight and I felt the patience and I felt the size of whatever is in there. She said, and I thought, I need more of this. Thessaly said, more. Sierra said, I had spent 40 years running from the uncomfortable things, the way everyone does, filling the space with noise and activity and distraction. And I sat near the corridor for 6 hours and I could not run from anything because the void is bigger than any noise you can make, and the presence in it is older than any distraction you can find. She said, and when I came out the other side of the 6 hours, I was different. Thessaly said, different how? Sierra said, clearer. The things I had been lying to myself about were visible. The things I had been postponing were obvious. The things that mattered were not complicated anymore. She said, and I thought, I want to offer this to people. She said, I want to bolt chairs to platforms and point them at the void and say, sit with it. Just sit with it. The thing you have been avoiding your entire life. The one that feels like the biggest and oldest and most patient thing you have ever felt. She said, just sit with it. She said, it is not going to hurt you. She said, it is going to tell you the truth. Thessaly looked at the viewport. She thought about the notation that the Valith Sovereignty's cartographic division had written. She thought about the corridor. She thought about the chairs. She said, it has been operating for how long? Sierra said, 3 years. We are at 80% occupancy year-round. The waiting list for the external platform bookings is 14 months. Thessaly said, 14 months. Sierra said, yes. She said, humans book 14 months in advance to sit in chairs in the void. Sierra said, the external platforms are the most popular feature. We have considered expanding the platform capacity, but we do not want to dilute the experience. Thessaly said, the experience. Sierra said, yes. She said, the presence is the product. She said, you cannot have too much of the presence because the presence is the reason you came. But you can have too many people, and then the experience of being genuinely in the void is interrupted by the awareness of other people also being in the void. She said, we keep it intimate. She said, we keep it direct. She said, no distractions. Thessaly said, even your resort is designed to eliminate the distractions. Sierra said, especially the resort. She said, the food is simple. The rooms are quiet. There is no entertainment programming. The staff are trained not to fill silences unnecessarily. She said, everything here is designed to make it easier to sit with the void. She said, because sitting with the void is what humans come here to do. Thessaly said, and it does not frighten you. Sierra said, some guests are frightened the first night. She said, and then? Sierra said, and then they sit with the fright, and then they are not frightened anymore. She said, and then they are present. She said, and then they are honest. Thessaly looked at the person who had been looking at the viewport. She had been looking at the viewport for the entire time Thessaly had been in the facility. She said, that guest, how long has she been here? Sierra said, that is Dr. Akafer. She is on her 12th day. She goes on the platforms at sunrise and sunset, which we define here by the facility's lighting cycle. She sits in the hub the rest of the time. Thessaly said, what is she looking at? Sierra said, the void. Thessaly said, for 12 days. Sierra said, she is a neuroscientist. She came here to think about a problem. She says the void is the best thinking environment she has ever used. She said she booked 3 more months when she arrived. Thessaly looked at Dr. Akafer. At the neuroscientist sitting in a chair looking at the void in the Veth corridor, the region that every species had mapped and notated and avoided, thinking about a problem. She thought about the second cognitive system that processes problems during sleep. She thought about the margin note at 200. She thought about sitting with the uncomfortable thing instead of running from it. She thought about the 14-month waiting list for the external platform bookings. She thought about the notation in the Valith Sovereignty's cartographic division that said the corridor like it was the only one. She thought about the chairs. She said, Director Adami. Sira said, please, Sira. She said, Sira, when you built this, when you applied for the licensing and found the construction crews and convinced the financial partners. She said, what did people say? Sira smiled. It was the same smile as before, the smile of someone who understood something from a perspective entirely different from the speaker's. She said, every species said the same thing. She said, they said, the corridor is dangerous. She said, and I said, it is not dangerous, it is uncomfortable. She said, and they said, the psychological effects. She said, and I said, yes, they are the product. She said, and they said, you want to sell access to a region of space that produces documented psychological effects on all known species. She said, and I said, yes. She said, and they said, why would anyone pay for that? She said, and I said, because the effects are what we have been trying to achieve our entire lives, and we have not found a more efficient way to achieve them. She said, because the presence and the weight and the patience and the size and the honesty. She said, that is what humans come here for. She said, that is what humans have always been looking for. She said, we just found the place where it already exists, and we bolted some chairs to the floor and turned the lights off. She said, and then we charged for it. Thessaly said, and people come. Sira said, the waiting list is 14 months. Thessaly looked at the viewport one more time. She thought about the recommendation she was going to write in her survey report. She thought about what category the Veth corridor should be in, and what notation it should have. She thought about the Valith Sovereignty's notation that said, the corridor. She thought about what came after it. She thought about what should come after it now. She thought about a resort with 14 occupied units, and chairs on external platforms and a 14-month waiting list, and a neuroscientist on her 12th day, thinking about a problem and booking 3 more months because it was the best thinking environment she had ever used. She thought about what the existing notation missed. She thought that the existing notation missed everything. She thought that the existing notation described what the corridor felt like to beings who were afraid of feeling small. She thought that there was apparently an entire species for whom feeling small was what you paid for. She thought that the most important piece of scientific evidence about human civilization she had encountered in 16 years of survey work was a woman sitting in a chair looking at the void, and a 14-month waiting list to join her. She filed it in the part of her mind where she kept things she did not yet have language for. She said goodbye to Sira Adami and thank you for the tour, and I will mention your brochure to our crew. She walked back through the pressure lock and the connecting corridor and the docking bay to the relentless current. She sat in the command chair. Drevin said, Commander. She said, yes. He said, your assessment. She said, add a notation to the cartographic record. He said, what notation? She thought about it. She said, add a notation below the existing one, below the one that says the corridor. He said, yes. She said, the notation says, humans built a resort here. He said, that is the notation. She said, that is the notation. He said, what does it mean? She said, it means the corridor is not what the existing notation says it is. She said, and it means that the beings who understood what it actually was came here and built chairs and turned the lights off and charged for the experience. She said, and it means the waiting list is 14 months. He said, I am not sure that is a standard cartographic notation. She said, no. She said, but it is the most accurate thing I can say about this place. She said, it is the most accurate thing anyone has said about this place in 40,000 years of the conclave mapping it. He said, and what does the accuracy tell us? She looked at the viewport, at the corridor, at the void that every species had feared, and that one species had turned into a destination. She thought about the chairs. She thought about the 14-month waiting list. She thought about what it meant that the thing every species feared was the thing one species had decided to charge admission for. She thought about what that said about that species. She thought about what that said about everything that species had built. She said, "It tells us that when we are afraid of something and they are not afraid of it, we should pay close attention to what they do with it." She said, "Because what they do with it is usually the most important thing about it." She said, "And we have been filing it under a void." She said, "Log it and let us go home." He logged it. They went home. Behind them, the Veth corridor held its patience, and its weight and its presence, and the thing inside it that was old and enormous and aware of small things that passed near it. Inside Void's Edge Resort, Dr. Akefer was in her chair at the viewport thinking about the problem. Two guests were on the external platforms in the dark. The Void was looking back, as it always had, waiting for whoever was next brave enough to sit with it and find out what it actually was.